Господин президент, коллеги.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, our conference is devoted to the topic war and peace, human being and the state and the conflict as the threat in the 21st century. And this conference was very interesting. We had some interesting and deep discussions, and we even read poetry during a special session devoted to Russian literature. We discussed many different aspects. We looked at the ratio between war and peace, what can influence the use of force and what can limit that. During the first session, whether the world needs the war, and we've discussed mostly how the perception of war changed in the last 200 years, and we noted that the war force is returning as a political tool. During another session devoted to communication, we said that the huge information abundance instead disunites people instead of uniting them. When we discussed the economy in the global and interdependent world, an instrument of the war or means of preserving peace, we discussed the influence of economic ties to the stability and whether we need practical content. We also discussed the role of diplomacy during session 5, correcting mistakes, which post-Cold War decisions have strengthened the peace, and we found out that we had quite a few mistakes. In addition to 5 regular sessions, we had some special sessions, the session on literature, and a special session on the Middle East and how to stop violence in the region. And of course, we spent many hours discussing to one another during our free time, and I would say that the conference was very productive and informative and interesting. At least this was my impression. And the final thing, we have prepared a very detailed report describing the results of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. I welcome all of you to this last ultimate session of the 12th Valdai Discussion Club. This is the session that I know virtually everyone in this room have been looking forward to, with a very distinguished set of speakers you'll hear. First of all, of course, the President of the Russian Federation. And I think I speak for all in the room when I say, President Putin, that we're grateful that you have so consistently over these 12 years taken time from your schedule to meet with a group like this. It has to be unusual. I think those of us from other countries recognize that no other national leader does this kind of thing. So at this point, the floor is yours. The Valdai Discussion Club looks forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you. Уважаемые коллеги, друзья.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you at today's meeting of the Valdai International Club. For more than a decade, it has been holding discussions on the most relevant problems, as well as ways and prospects for the development of Russia and the whole world. Naturally, the composition of participants keeps changing, but there is a core of the discussion platform which has turned into an environment where everyone manages to understand each other. This open intellectual forum with open discussions, the exchange of views, assessments, and outlooks are very important for Russia. Let me thank all Russian and foreign politicians, experts, public figures, and journalists who contribute to the work of this club. This year, the focus of the discussions is the issues of war and peace. This topic has been grasping the minds of the humankind throughout the history. As far back as in the ancient world, there were debates about the nature and causes of conflict and fair and unfair use of force, on whether wars would always go hand in hand with the development of civilization, alternating with ceasefires, or there would finally be time where differences and contradictions would be settled without wars. Naturally, our great writer, Leo Tolstoy, was quoted here in his great novel, War and Peace. He called war contrary to the human reason, and to the whole of human nature, and he believed that peace is a benefit for people. Indeed, peace and peaceful life have always been an ideal for the humankind. State figures, philosophers, and lawyers have been coming up with different models of peaceful cooperation of powers. Different alliances and coalitions proclaim their purpose to uphold the lasting, as it was once called, eternal world. The problem is that the way out of the piling up contradictions was often made through the war, and the war itself served as a means of the development of new post-war global hierarchies. And peace at the state of global politics was never sustainable, and it never emerged by itself. Period of peace in European and global history were based on reinforcing and maintaining the existing balance of power. It happened in the 17th century during the Peace of Westphalia, which put an end to the 30 Years' War. It also happened in the 19th century, in the times of the Congress of Vienna, and 70 years ago in Yalta, when countries that defeated Nazism decided to establish the UN and develop the principles guiding the relations among states. With the emergence of nuclear power, it became obvious that in a global conflict there can be no winners. There can be only one outcome: guaranteed mutual destruction. It turned out that people, in their attempts to come up with more destructive arms, made a big war pointless. By the way, a generation of global leaders in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s treated the use of military force as a measure of last resort. And in this context, they behaved responsibly, pondering carefully over all the circumstances and possible consequences. The end of Cold War terminated ideological confrontation. However, the grounds for confrontations and geopolitical contradictions by no means disappeared. All states would always have their own, sometimes diverging interests. And the development of global history has always been accompanied by the competition among powers and its allies, and I believe it is only natural. The most important is for this competition to be developed within the framework of certain political, legal, and moral rules and norms. Otherwise, rivalry and clashes of interests could be fraught with acute crises and dramatic breakdowns. We witnessed it more than once in the past, and today, unfortunately, we are facing a similar situation once again. The attempts to promote by hook or by crook a model of unilateral dominance have led to the unbalancing of international law and global governance, which means that there is a threat that the competition, political, economic, and military one, could become unmanageable. What could this unmanageable competition mean for international security? It could mean a growing number of local conflicts, especially in border regions where interests of leading powers and blocs clash. It would also mean a most probable decline of the non-proliferation system of weapons of mass destruction, which is very dangerous, and as a result, a new spiral in the arms race. There have been developed a concept of the so-called disarming first strike, including with the use of long-range, high-precision, non-nuclear weapons, which have effects similar to nuclear arms. Under the pretext of nuclear and missile threats emanating from Iran, as we know, the fundamentals of modern international security have been destroyed. The ABM Treaty. The United States unilaterally withdrew from this treaty. By the way, today the Iranian nuclear program has been solved. There is no longer any threat from Iran, and as we insisted, it didn't even exist. That is why the course which made our American partners build the missile defense system is no longer there. And we have all the rights to believe that the efforts aimed at the development of MD by the United States would stop. And in reality, nothing like that is happening. Recently, the first tests of the missile defense system have been made by the United States in Europe. What does it mean? It means when we were debating with our American partners, we were actually right. There were attempts to dilute us and the whole world. And in other words, we were just deceived. And it's not about the hypothetical Iranian nuclear threats, which was no longer there. It is about the attempt to upset the strategic balance and change the correlation of powers in one's own benefit, in order not only to dominate, but to be able to dictate one's own will to everyone, and including to geopolitical competitors and allies. Is an extremely dangerous scenario which is detrimental to everyone, including the United States themselves. The deterring factor of nuclear weapons started to devalue. Some have started to cherish an illusion that in a world conflict there could be once again a decisive victory of one side without irreversible, unacceptable consequences for the winners, if there would be any. Over the last quarter of a century, the use of force threshold has clearly been lowered. Anti-war immunity that have been acquired after 2 global wars, which, by the way, existed literally at a psychological and subconscious level, started to wear off. The very perception of war has changed. For people sitting in front of the TV screens, it has turned into a spectacular media performance, as if military actions do not inflict sufferings, losses, and do not destroy cities and the whole states. Unfortunately, military terminology has become commonplace in all aspects of our life. For example, the reality of today's global economy is trade and sanction wars. They have become commonplace in mass media reports, and sanctions are also used as a tool of unfair competition in order to squeeze out or throw out competitors from the market. As an example, let me cite the real epidemics of fines, including those imposed by European companies and against European companies by the United States. They use exaggerated pretexts and severely punish all those who dare violate unilateral American sanctions. Maybe it is not up to Russia to decide, but it is a discussions platform after all. That is why I dare ask whether anyone is having the right to deal like that with allies. No, that's how people are dealing with vassals who dare behave independently. They're being punished for misbehaving. Only last year alone, there was an arrest introduced on one of the French banks amounting to $8.9 billion. Toyota paid $1.2 billion. The commerce banks signed an agreement paying $1.4 billion to the American budget, and so on and so forth. We see how untransparent economic alliances being formed, and these structures are being formed observing almost all the rules of conspiracy, and the task is clear: to rearrange world economy in such a way so as to reap greater dividends from one's own dominance and the spread of one's own standards of economic trade and technological regulation, the establishment of economic alliances, and through imposing one's own terms by the strongest will not make a world a safer place. It would lay ground for further conflicts. The WTO was established back in the past. Yes, indeed, the discussions are very complex. Maybe Doha round is stalling, but still we need to come to terms and reach compromises, because it is up to compromises to lay the foundations for the long-term sustainable system, first of all in economy. If the concerns of the participants of foreign economic activity are ignored it doesn't mean that these contradictions and concerns would disappear. They will still be there, they will be outstanding, which means that they would lead to more important and serious consequences. You know that we have a different approach. Developing the Eurasian Economic Union, we are trying to build mutually beneficial relations with our trading partners. We are trying to cooperate with the Chinese initiative of the Silk Road. We are openly and working within the BRICS, APEC, and G20 on an equitable basis. Global information space is also suffering from shockwaves of war. The only true standpoint and interpretation of events is being opposed. Certain facts are being manipulated and suppressed. We are all used to the distribution of labels and the development of the enemy image. The authorities of the countries who have always seemed to advocate for the freedom of expression, as we used to hear in the past, are now trying to hinder the development and spread of the objective information, and they call a point of view which is different from their own a hostile propaganda which should be countered exclusively by non-democratic means. Unfortunately, such words as war and conflict have become commonplace when it comes to relations between people of different cultural, religious, and national backgrounds. Today, hundreds of thousands of migrants are trying to get integrated into a different society without having no specialized skills, without knowing the language, tradition, and cultures of the countries of destination. And the local population, let's put it frank here, local population is irritated by the strangers inflowing in their countries. They are complaining about an increasing crime rate and money spent on the refugees from the budgets of relevant countries. Yes, indeed, there are lots of people present here who empathize with those people and who are willing to help them. The question is how to do that without the detriment of the interests of local populations of the countries where migrants are inflowing. This shocking, uncontrollable clash between different lifestyles could lead to or is already driving nationalism and intolerance and the emergence of a permanent conflict in the society. Dear colleagues, let us be realistic. The military might will always be there and will always be a tool in international politics. For good or for worse, it's a different question. That's what reality looks like. The question is whether it is going to be used when all other resources and means have been exhausted and when there is a need to confront common threats such as terrorism. And based on the well-known rules enshrined in international law, or fists would be used at every possible pretext in order just to demonstrate who the master is without thinking twice about the legitimacy of the use of force and the consequences of such actions, without addressing the problems but rather multiplying them. We know what's going on in the Middle East. For decades or even centuries, there have been piling up interethnic, religious, and political contradictions, the acutest social problems. In other words, a Molotov cocktail which has been brewing there, and external attempts to egregiously rearrange the region became a match or a spark which led to the real explosion, to the destruction of statehood, the outburst of terrorism, and eventually growing risks for the whole world. The terrorist organization, so-called Islamic State, gained control over vast territories. How did it manage to do so? Just think about it. In case of the seizure of Damascus and Baghdad, terrorist groups could have obtained the status of a virtually official authority, and then there would have been created a foothold for global expansion. Does anyone think about that? The international community as a whole needs to understand what we are dealing with. The enemy of civilization, humankind, and culture. sowing the ideology of hatred and barbarity and defying morals as well as values of global religions, including Islam. One shouldn't play with words differentiating between moderate and immoderate terrorists. What is the difference, after all? Probably some might think that the difference is in the fact that moderate gangsters are killing or beheading people softly or in moderate quantities. What we are seeing today is the conglomerate of terrorist groups. Yes, indeed, sometimes militants from the Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra, and other followers of and splinters of Al-Qaeda of all the sorts are fighting against each other. But what they are fighting for is for the financial sources, for the sources of income, and for the breeding ground. Their methods and logic are the same: terror, killings, attempts of turning people into cowed, intimidated, and controllable mass. The situation has been deteriorating recently. The infrastructure of terrorists has been growing, and the number of militants has been increasing. Weapons transferred to so-called moderate opposition ended up in the hands of the Islamic State. Sometimes the whole gangs defected to the side of the Islamic State, so-called, accompanied by brass bands and flying colors. Why have the efforts of the Americans and their allies in the fight against the Islamic State given tangible results? It is obvious that it's not because of the shortage of military capabilities. It goes without saying that the United States have the biggest military capability in the world. The thing is that it is difficult to hold a double game, declare the war against terrorists, and at the same time try to use terrorists in order to arrange pieces at the chessboard of the Middle East to meet one's own interests. It is impossible to defeat terrorists if some of these terrorists are used as a tool to oust undesirable regimes. You won't be able to get anywhere from these terrorists. And it is an illusion that, after all, you'll be able to deal with them, to oust them from power, or to negotiate with them. And the situation in Libya is the best example of this. Let us hope that the new government would be able to stabilize the situation. But it is not a reality yet. But indeed, we need to contribute to the stabilization. We understand perfectly well that the militants fighting in the Middle East are a threat to everyone, including to Russia. Our country knows what terrorist aggression means. They know what havoc was wreaked by thugs in the northern Caucasus. We remember the bloody terrorist attacks in Budanovsk, Moscow, Beslan, Volgograd, and many other cities. Russia has always been fighting against terrorism in all its manifestations. It has been consistently calling for the international community to get united in the fight against this common evil. That is why we made a proposal establishing a broad anti-terrorism coalition, as I've mentioned in my presentation in the UN. After the request on the side of the official Syrian authorities to provide requests, we decided to launch the military operation in this country. Let me stress that it is fully legitimate. Its only goal is to contribute to the attainment of peace. I'm confident that the actions of Russian military would have necessary positive impact on the situation. We would be able to help the legitimate authorities in Syria to set the case for further political settlement and to make a preemptive blow to terrorists which are threatening our country as well. And thus, we would be able to help all countries and peoples who are in danger of these terrorists coming back homes. What is to be done in order to ensure long-term settlement in the region? It's social, economic, and political recovery. To our view, First of all, we need to liberate the territory of Syria and Iraq from terrorists and to prevent them from infiltrating into other regions. In order to achieve that, we need to join all our forces, regular armies of Iraq and Syria, Kurdish militia and various groups of opposition who are willing to contribute to the destruction of terrorists. What is needed is to coordinate the actions of the countries of the region and beyond fighting against terror. Joint anti-terrorist activities should rely on international law. Secondly, it is obvious that the mere military victory over the rebels would not settle all the problems, but it would create the preconditions for the most important thing, the beginning of the political process with the participation of all adequate, patriotic forces of the Syrian society. Syrians should define their future by themselves, with solely delicate, respectful assistance of the international community, rather than coercive measures through ultimatums, blackmails, and threats. The tumbling of the official authorities in Syria would only mobilize terrorists. What is needed now is, instead of undermining, revive statehood institutions in the zone of conflict. Let me remind you of the fact that throughout its history, Middle East always was a scene for confrontations between various empires and powers. They reject and rearranged the order of the region to suit their own needs and to meet their own interests, and the consequences were not very pleasant for people living there. And by the way, they were not asked about their own future. They were the last who actually found out about what's going on in their countries. That is why the question is, isn't it finally the high time for the international community to coordinate all of its activities with the people living on those territories? I believe that it is high time to do that. These people, as many other people, all other people, should be treated with respect. Of principled importance is to engage in the political settlement the Muslim spiritual leaders of Islam and heads of Muslim states. We count on their consolidated position and assistance, on their moral authority. It is important to protect people, particularly young people, from the destructive influence of ideology of terrorists who are trying to use them as gun fodder. We should clearly differentiate between true Islam, whose values include peace, family, good deeds, helping one's neighbor and respecting traditions, and lies and hatred sown by militants, justifying themselves by Islam. Fourth, it is high time right now to elaborate on the roadmaps for economic and social recovery of the region, on the development of basic infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and housing. Only after this work, creative work is carried out on the ground, after the political settlement is reached, could put an end to the huge flow of refugees to the European countries and the return of those who have left already. It is obvious that Syria would need large-scale financial, economic, humanitarian assistance in order to heal the wounds of the war. We need to agree on the format in the framework of which we could carry out these activities with the participation of donors, international financial institutions. Right now, the Syrian issue is being discussed within the UN and other international organizations within the framework of interstate relations. Yes, indeed, not always we manage to come to understanding. It is tantalizingly difficult to give up failed expectations and miscalculations. Nevertheless, progress is there. We see that within the framework of the anti-terrorist operation, there are contacts between military being established gradually, although not that actively. A huge step forward was the agreement reached between Russia and America on the safety measures for warplanes flying over the territory of Syria. We're about to start exchanging information with our Western colleagues on dislocations and transfers of militants. All of these are steps in the right direction. The most important is for us to treat each other as allies in our common fight, to be open and frank. That is the only way to guarantee our victory over terrorists. No matter how dramatic today's situation is, Syria could be a role model for the partnership for the sake of common interests and addressing problems that are affecting everyone in order to shape an efficient risk management system. We had this opportunity at the end of the Cold War. Unfortunately, we missed this opportunity. We had this opportunity at the beginning of 2000, when Russia, the United States, and a number of other countries were faced with terrorist aggression. We failed to uphold the high momentum of cooperation, unfortunately. I'm not going back to the reasons behind that. I believe they're all everyone is aware of them. The most important today is to learn right lessons and to move forward. I believe that the experience that we have accumulated and today's situation would help us make the right choice for the benefit of cooperation, mutual respect and trust, and for the benefit of peace. I thank you for your attention.
Mr. President, thank you so much for beginning this session by sharing your further thoughts beyond the speech that you gave at the UN and the speeches that you've been giving recently, and particularly in this context of war and peace. I know there's going to be a good deal of interest in talking to you, raising questions about the last part of what you had to say, the turbulence in the Islamic South, the Syrian case. But I would start by highlighting the way you began, that is the notion of the way war in many different connotations and many different forms is insidiously invading the mentality of media, politicians, and publics in too many contexts, and then specifically in raising again the issue that has been too neglected in the post-Cold War period. That is the issue of nuclear weapons among those states that have them, the 9. We've been very much focused, as rightly so, on the problem of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. But as you know, there are very dangerous and very complex developments that are now occurring among the nuclear weapons possessing states. In the context of the deterioration and the failures post 1991 and 2000 that you highlighted, the tragedy is that the two countries that still have 92% of the weapons and that will have to exercise leadership if we are going to begin not only saving the regime that we created over the last 40 years, but taking the next steps, are the ones that will have to exercise that leadership. And in the present circumstance, one of the things that we need to reflect on is that those two countries are either not able or at this point not willing to exercise that leadership. You're joined by 3 very distinguished fellow national leaders, and I begin with the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, Ali Larijani. Speaker Larijani, the floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
In the name of Allah, benevolent and merciful, dear Mr. President, distinguished members of the Presidium, distinguished guests and participants, ladies and gentlemen. In the beginning, let me first of all express my satisfaction by the fact that I'm present here at this forum among the researchers of foreign policy, and I hope that this meeting that we are hosting here in this beautiful location will reach its goals. I'm going to talk about the region that covers such Asian countries as Afghanistan and Pakistan and includes some Middle East countries and North Africa countries. What unites all these countries is the crisis life in the situation of terrorism, wars, and political instability. In spite of the fact that the problem of terrorism is of global nature and almost all countries in this or that way are involved in that, and thousands of Americans and Europeans are also members of such terrorist groups such as ISIS. Nevertheless, the center that has to deal with terrorism is in this region. In the last several years, this region encountered such things as wars, interventions, and permanent political chaos, which could not help influencing the development of terrorism. And on the whole, we may state that this region in the last years suffered from complete disorganization in the area of security. What are the roots and the reasons of this lack of organization? First of all, from the point of view of distributing international forces after the end of the two-polar world times and then the failure of unipolar world order, almost all countries that were linked to this polarization of global forces ended up hung in the air. Some of them looking for the opportunities to strengthen their role or their influence used the help of extremism. Some small countries using money and fairly rude political dealership almost practically helped to create this tension in the region. On the whole, we may say that when the period of polarization was over, the previous discipline in the area of security, even though there were mistakes, was completely destroyed without any alternative. Dictatorships, which often were dependent on the US and Western countries and for many years remained the citadel of power, with the growth of science and education and additional opportunities for communication, faced such phenomena as political awareness of people, especially among youth, and today's requirements of and demands of the youth in those countries are not just limited by give us water, bread and work. It's more and more about political and religious ideals and participating in defining their own future. And people interact with governments, and the youth are leaving the political scene and fall into traps of terrorist groups. The occupation of countries that for the last couple of decades happened in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and creating chaos in such countries as Syria in reality became the reason of why many people came to terrorist groups. And this fact is interesting from the point of view of social psychology. When people in a country feel contempt to themselves because they are under the oppression of soldiers from another country, especially if these soldiers are rude and stupid in the way they behave, of course the younger generation is not going to tolerate that. They are going to look for ways to resist the occupation. And in this sense, the youth is an excellent target to be recruited by terrorists. An illustration of the correctness of this view is the way they create terrorist groups in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's why wars and occupations always create productive soil for terrorist movements. The same happened during the war in Yemen, when terrorists spread their influence over the southern regions of that country. My fourth point, tactical and instrumental approach of major powers to the problems of terrorism is a huge strategic mistake made by those powers in the last decades. As most terrorist movements were formed, you can see the trace of intelligent forces of some major countries. Even in the current situation, when leaders of countries usually point out the threat of terrorism, it's quite obvious that in the Syrian crisis, large countries disguise terrorists as a moderate opposition, and they provide them with weapons and other opportunities. They believe that they will be able to stop terrorism or terrorists after they use them in their interests, and some such instrumental approaches are the main thing that lead to the development of terrorism. But the terrorists themselves use these immature ideas in the best way for their benefit, and when terrorist movements gain strength, they will be aiming at their own interests, and it's going to be hard to fight them. It's neither the occupation of Afghanistan nor the occupation of Iraq defeated the terrorists, and unfortunately this story is going to continue. My fifth point, mistakes in the evaluation of terrorism and wrong approaches are yet another reason of spreading the terror of terrorism in the region. For example, the U.S. government and some of their allies stated that they want to create and strengthen the moderate opposition in Syria, and for that purpose they trained hundreds of servicemen, gave them weapons and sent them to the battlefield. According to the reports of military officers of the U.S. force that was presented to the Congress, all those hundreds of people with their weapons and equipment and vehicles, they joined terrorist groups. And the final example is what happened with Jibhat al-Nusra. Only 5 or 6 people remained. Others joined that group. And didn't the intelligence service and the army intelligence services of the coalition, could they not identify those people? Or some countries that are helping them financially abused this immature policy, and in a sense they are disguising the terrorists as moderate opposition. How the U.S. is going to create moderate opposition, and how are they going to give Syria over to the hands of the opposition? Today, the countries that are part of the coalition cannot say that they are helping the moderate opposition, because it's quite clear that they have no ability to distinguish moderate terrorists from non-moderate ones. If they could give entire Syria to terrorists, and they say, oh, we made a mistake, the same one that we made in Libya.
What should we do? I think that the main pillar of the security of the region is the responsible role of the regional actors or states. With all the peculiarities of the region and rising the consciousness of the people, strong security regime is possible only if the regional states play an active role. And certainly the major countries who are superpowers may play a certain role there. But under the current context, bearing in mind the internal situation within the countries and the unjustified concepts of certain people, the integration which pursues the objective of returning back to the previous regime of security is very improbable, very unlikely. Let's pay attention to the two factors which may drive the region to the safe and security situation. The countries of the region which have the realistic impression of what is going on in the region and which demonstrate the political will to fight against terrorism. Certainly there are certain shades of this phenomena, and not all of them are equal. Iran has always condemned terrorism and fought against terrorism and paid a very high price for that. Certain other countries, which all the time hold consultations with Iran regarding the Arab issue and other issues, are also concerned and are also interested in providing help. But really, they didn't make much progress in that respect. But for some political statements they made. But if they take advantage of the potential of support, then in that case they may come a fore. Secondly, the responsible world powers providing assistance, cooperating with the conscious countries of the region may translate the war on terrorism into something more tangible, more material. But at the same time, the role of Russia remains enormous, followed by the role of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement and China. The role of this group of countries is about the following. It causes the anxiousness and concerns of many other countries which would like to provide certain assistance. It may serve as the foundation for the first step in forming the anti-terrorist coalition. Russia intervened into Syria at the invitation of the official government is very much welcome in our opinion, and the coalition led by the United States, whose actions remain just on paper and who did almost nothing over the last year, and just promoted the actions of the terrorists. The actions of Russia at the same time became a serious warning for the terrorists and influenced very much the main essence of the problem and not influenced its propaganda image. I think that other responsible organizations and countries have to join these forces and therefore promote the security. Dear participants, bearing in mind the technological equipment of the terrorists, we should not have this. We should not believe that it would not take too long. The terrorists got training in the schools, which enjoyed investments for many, many years. And although it was not typical of the Islamic tradition, and none of the Islamic movements, neither Hanbaliti, neither Shafi'iti, neither Malikiti or Hanafiti or Shias, Sufites or Zidites approved the actions of terrorists. But still, new and new sects are being set up, and although they are not numerous in terms of their followers, but thanks to the financial support, they are attracting more terrorists, and heresy becomes their ideology. They think this is justified and right to kill other people. Those sects dispatch their people, their envoys to other countries in order to propagate their theories and to organize the mass disorders. On the other hand, these flows, these movements are being supported by huge funds and financial support. And despite the fact that the leaders of the huge Islamic mazhabs, for instance, the academics from the Sunni university and Sunnis and Shia leaders believe that this is a perversion of Islam. That's why the fight with terrorists on the battlefields, as well as the diplomatic efforts, have to focus on the cultural roots and origins of these movements. It's necessary to come to common understanding of these origins, of these root causes, and to resort to certain cultural actions to fight against terrorism. Such a struggle might set certain order and certain ranking among the nations. The main question which arises is whether this order, which has to be quite lengthy and protruded and long-term, be formed without a theory of a strategic coalition. If we keep thinking about war on terrorism, pursuing some short-sighted objectives, these, for instance, resorting to the tactical methods as the West does, then I do think that we'll be a failure in this struggle, in this fight. We have to admit this fact that after the quantity and quality spreading of terrorism in the region, we cannot treat this phenomena lightheartedly. If we estimate the means of spreading of terrorism in the region thoroughly, then we may come to a conclusion that terrorism has been developing in a spiral. It started as a guerrilla fight, in the mountains of Afghanistan, and now it is spread all over the world. Terrorism possesses of many territories and lots of weapons. For instance, the ISIS alone has the budget of more than $30 billion. They have petroleum in order to replenish their resources and financial means, and they get some financial assistance from many countries. That's why fight against the ISIS and against these movements are not temporary. We will need the long-term organization in order to set the security in this region. At the same time, we need long-term strategic ties and bonds, which should include different aspects: the cultural aspects, the political aspects, economic aspects, and the ones of security, so that the responsible countries are more trusting each other and to make this trust more profound. I'd like to thank my Russian friends for their hospitality. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Speaker Lariani, for the comments, the introduction. Over the last 2 or 3 days, several people have commented on the fundamental change in the core discussion at the Valdai Club from last year. Last year, the featured issue, the central question, was Ukraine. This year, it has been Syria and the turbulent region that you've just been speaking about. We all appreciate the strategic view that you've brought to the topic, and we are most grateful that you are at the session, so thank you. The next speaker is the former President of the Czech Republic, Václav Klaus, and I give the floor to him.
Mr. President, dear colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I must say that I have never been to Sochi, and to this audience I have to say that I have never been south of Moscow, inside Russia. So I am really glad to be here. We are expected this afternoon in this session to talk about threats. On the one hand, it seems to me that we spent the whole 3 days talking about threats, full 3 days. But now we are expected to say something else. Therefore, my suggestion, my intention is to change the perspective. Everyone to be less geopolitical. Everyone was speaking about has been speaking about external threats only. Somebody else is threatening us. I would like, even without expecting the discussion here, I prepared a few ideas under the title, "The Threat is Us." It may sound surprising and paradoxical to some of you. Like many of you, I feel a great threat to our future, to our freedom, democracy, peace, security, and prosperity just now. Immediately after the fall of communism, we were, at least in our part of the world, fascinated by the end of oppression and totalitarian practices, and had a feeling we entered a new, very promising era. Yes and no. With the benefit of hindsight, we see now that it was a short-sighted, extremely optimistic interpretation of events. Surprisingly and paradoxically, the problems of the current era started at that moment. The fall of communism released processes, ambitions, and erroneous concepts and ways of thinking, which gradually, step by step, led to the current state of affairs. It was generally assumed that it was sufficient to get rid of the political, economic, and social system of communism, which was a task in which some of the post-communist countries succeeded. I would dare claiming that my country was one of them. It was at that time, however, not sufficiently understood that it was not enough. While building a new system, it would have been necessary to avoid bringing with us the old misconceptions, a priorisms, and fallacies, as well as vested interests, and to avoid creating new ones. I would like to be very clear, and I would like to stress that when I say this, that I don't mean just in the East. Current problems in the world stem more from the West than from the East now, especially not from the East in the old sense. My strong views about it reflect my looking at the world from Europe, from Central Europe, from Prague. That's why I'm motivated to speak about our problems and about us. Europe has not been discussed very much during the last 3 days, but Europe is a place where the failure of the current developments is more profound than in other parts of the world. To be correctly understood, I don't compare the absolute size of catastrophic developments and of human suffering, but the relative degree of failure. And Europe has failed more than any other part of the world in the last decades. From that perspective, the greatest threat to our peace, freedom, and prosperity, and democracy, is not the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, or the barbarous assassins of all stripes in many parts of the world. It is not the EU, Washington, or Moscow bureaucrats with their never-ending attempts to mastermind and control our lives. It is even not the alarmist and populist media with their attempts at mediocrity, nor is it the autocratic big global bankers, businessmen, and participants at the Davos World Economic Forum, where I 17 times participated to say, nor the remaining dictators. The problem is that we, together with our fellow citizens, are weak, opportunistic, and indecisive, that our inactivity suggests our loss of vitality, our lack of self-confidence, and our growing fatigue, that we are without courage and without a clear, positive vision of the future, that we are forgetting common sense and common purpose, that we are showing our apparent incapacity to learn lessons from the past and to appreciate the meaning and role of history, that we are victims of new failed isms, of human rightism, of multiculturalism, of environmentalism, of homosexualism, of cosmopolitanism, and transnationalism, that we have become victims of and at the same time contributors to the fallacy of political correctness. A new class of relatively affluent pleasure seekers in the Western world, which means us, is undermining the very institutions that made our free and prosperous world possible. We pretend not to see it. We are not determined to stop the multiculturalist crusade against Western civilization. We are not ready to defend our values, our culture, our religion, our lifestyles. We are not ready to sacrifice our relatively comfortable life and start seriously taking care of freedom and democracy. We do not courageously contest the continental-wide and planetary thinking and do not protect the nation-state as the only reliable guarantor and guardian of democracy. I mentioned my Central European roots and my Central European perspective or angle of vision. I don't pretend knowing this country sufficiently well. But let me say that I don't think that Russia is immune from the same dangers. Nevertheless, I am optimistically convinced that we can and have to search for a rational and feasible ways, for a rational and feasible program and vision which could give us guidance how to behave. We should start at home with ourselves, with practical and realizable moves. We shouldn't seek global solutions and give advice to other people. I disagree with suggestions mentioned here many times in the past 3 days that we have to create a new world order. This is a wishful thinking. This is a new utopia. We should support free trade, opening up of countries, free trade, free exchange of people and ideas, growing internationalization of human activities, but we should oppose transnationalism and global governance. We live, as was mentioned many times here, again, in a divided world. There was a chance, or at least a hope, to overcome this division at the beginning of the 1990s, but there existed an unfavorable asymmetry. The East was weak and had to concentrate on its long overdue homework to build a normal society. The West was, to a greater extent than was desirable and justified, convinced of its perfection and superiority, and was not ready to deal with us. I try to argue all the time that we were able to be meaningful partners because we didn't feel defeated. Who was defeated was our communist regime, not us. We were, however, not listened to. We should ask ourselves, are we prepared to do anything, and do we really want to? I am not sure about it. We are not ready to get rid of our still comfortable life and of our prejudices. We don't have strong views. In our countries, we are witnesses of the increasing public apathy, of the undergoing trivialization and denigration of education, not to speak about the massive presence of ideological indoctrination, which reminds me of the communist era. We replace education with indoctrination in political correctness. I have a longer speech prepared. I gave the electronic version of it to the organizers, so I will stop here. I'm sure we have to talk openly and sincerely about these issues. I wish the Valdai Club discussions to become a productive setting for understanding, discussing, and opposing all these tendencies. I skipped over one paragraph of my speech, Mr. Chairman of Bystritsky. I couldn't believe my eyes when I discovered in the title of this evening session the word general progress. I suppose that this term is the relic from the past, and I was surprised that it was still used at the Valdai discussions. Plus, I agree with the British conservative thinker Edmund Burke when he said in 1770, ironically, the world advances progressively backward. After a quarter of a millennium, I am almost inclined to agree with him. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, President Klaus. The originality of your thought doesn't disappoint, even when it's provocative, because it is driven by impassioned concern, and it enriches our conversation. Several of you have referred to the end of the Cold War and the period of promise that it opened. No one was more central on the U.S. side and more at the center of what was happening during that period, the end of the Cold War, than Ambassador Jack Matlock. He now sees where we are 25 years later. Ambassador Matlock, the floor is yours.
Уважаемый господин президент,
Dear Mr.
Anne
President
Presidente,
and
Mr. Chairman,
heads,
ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank the organizing committee for their invitation to join you at this conference, and particularly to give me the opportunity to speak along with such a distinguished panel. Now, they asked me to prepare something for 7 minutes, and I've done so, but it'll probably take me a few more than that. I don't intend to refer directly to the other presentations, all of them challenging, all of them interesting, but rather to think back at how we handled crises in the past. After all, I am a survivor, some might say a relic, of the generation that negotiated the end of the Cold War. And since that time, I retired from the American Foreign Service 24 years ago, I have been studying how it happened and thinking about whether this has relevance to us today. Perhaps it might. Thinking back to the time in the early 1980s when the Cold War seemed to be at its height, I can recall that those of us who were advising President Reagan were asked to devise a plan for negotiating, in effect negotiating the end of the arms race. We were not so ambitious to think that we could end the Cold War totally, but we began to look at that and think about what the problems were. Now, I might say that we hear comments today that we are in Cold War II. And certainly, if you look at the polemics and the heat of some of the accusations and so on, one would think this is reminiscent of the Cold War. But I would point out that the issues in the Cold War were far deeper, being ideological. At the time, we were in a very dangerous arms race, one that was costly to all of our countries, and there were confrontations almost over the world. In fact, the problems were greater then than they are today, serious as they are. And I think that's one thing to remember when we start thinking about, well, how did we get out of that? Basically, we ended the Cold War, we and the leaders of the Soviet Union and the leading European countries, by negotiation. I don't have time to go into the details. In fact, I've written 3 books that goes into them. But basically, every agreement we made with the Soviet Union was also in the interest of the Soviet Union. We designed an agenda in cooperation with the Soviet negotiators. And though most people paid great attention, as they should have, to the meetings of our presidents, and also increasing number of meetings of foreign ministers and others. There was a tremendous amount of work done at lower levels, and at times almost continuous consultation. At one point, my office found that we were consulting on 86 different topics, and at the expert level, at the deputy minister level. This was a continuous thing, and what we were trying to do was find an acceptable end to these problems, and particularly to find a way to end that totally senseless and extremely dangerous arms race. Now, just a few things I would mention that I think may be relevant today. One is that when then General Secretary Gorbachev and President Reagan met for the first time, one of the things they agreed on was that a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, and that means there can be no war between us. In other words, both sides took war off the table at the very beginning. And I must say, neither threatened the other at any time during these negotiations. But this was also a recognition that why are we building all these arms? We're not going to use them. We're in effect robbing our people in doing so, and we're leaving a dangerous world because there can be accidents. There can be, a loss of control, perhaps, of some of them. So that commitment was one of the basic ones that allowed us to go forward. In effect, we were not threatening each other. And when I hear today at times that we can't take military action off the table, I remember that the way we ended the Cold War was by taking real war off the table at the beginning. Now, the end of the Cold War was, as I've said, by negotiation in which everybody was a winner. We all came out better. And it ended well before the Soviet Union broke up. One of the most deceptive myths that we face today, and which influences policies and attitudes that we hear today, is that the Cold War ended with the breakup of the Soviet Union and was in effect forced by the West. That simply is not true. And I know that this is something that is held both in the West and both here, but it does not fit the facts. The fact is that in ending the Cold War, we, as I said, we negotiated an end. I think ideologically it was over no later than December 1988, and in practice by the fall of 1989. I can testify as an American diplomat that we and Soviet diplomats were cooperating in many things to put an end to, you might say, the debris of the Cold War, just as allies. And as a matter of fact, Ronald Reagan said in his memoirs that when he parted with Mikhail Gorbachev in their last meeting, when Reagan was president, he said, "We parted as partners to make a better world." And by the way, Ronald Reagan never said we won the Cold War. In fact, he had often warned us as we were negotiating, when we find a solution, we must not consider it victory, because if it lasts, it has to suit both sides. The Cold War ended not with the victory of the West, with a negotiation. Now, how did the Soviet Union break up? The Soviet Union broke up because of internal matters. And the idea that somehow the West broke up the Soviet Union simply amazes me. I know that this almost is the common view of many people now, but they didn't experience actually what happened, or they didn't reflect much about it. The fact is that as far as the United States was concerned, and most of our principal European allies, we were doing our best to help Gorbachev build a voluntary federation. We were doing our best to persuade Yeltsin, who by '91 was the elected leader of the Russian Socialist Federated Soviet Republic, to cooperate with Gorbachev and keep the country together. Yes, we believed that the three Baltic nations should regain their independence. We had never recognized them as a part of the Soviet Union, but we really preferred to see a voluntary union of the other 12 republics. So how did they break up? Who was the key leader that broke up the Soviet Union? The elected leader of Russia, Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin, who, in cooperation with the leader of Belarus and Ukraine, in effect declared the end of the Soviet Union. So the idea that somehow the West caused this collapse, which is implicit in many of the emotional statements we hear today, simply doesn't fit the facts. Was the breakup of the Soviet Union a tragedy? I'm not sure I would call it the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, but it was definitely a negative phenomenon, and one which I made that clear in the book I wrote about the breakup of the Soviet Union. And I said it in a way that when it happened, I could not uncork champagne and drink a toast, because I thought there would have been better solutions, that we would have been better off without it. And by the way, I think that was also, even earlier, President Bush's opinion when he went to Kiev in August 1st, 1991, in his speech to the Supreme Rada. He recommended directly that the Ukrainians and the other non-Baltic Soviet republics adhere to Gorbachev's Union Treaty. He also warned against suicidal nationalism and made clear that freedom and independence were not synonymous, that one should choose freedom. So this is why I got rather disturbed when we hear rhetoric that implies that somehow it was the West or the United States that brought down the Soviet Union. If you're going to blame anybody or any people, it was the elected leader of Russia. Because if Russia was unwilling to join the others in a voluntary federation, and if President Yeltsin was so determined to get rid of Gorbachev, how could anybody else keep the Union together? Now, I want to say just a word about some that we hear bandied about a lot. That is the world unipolar? Is it multipolar? Or so on. I would say it is non-polar, because the problem, and the problem that has developed over the last few decades, is that much power has been, in effect, taken away from the hands of states. It is not governments and states that are determining the main thing here. And I'm speaking not only about non-governmental organizations, about international corporations, about criminals, or terrorists only. In general, power is very much diffused. And the idea that it ever could be or was exercised by a single power, I think, is a misunderstanding. My time has probably already run out, but I do want to make just a couple of comments about today. Of course, the situation in Ukraine has been one of the big causes of the polemics and tensions between the United States and Russia, and also between the EU and Russia. Obviously, I don't have time to talk about that in detail, but I would simply observe that it seems to me that some of Russia's actions have been very damaging in the long run to Russia's true interests. I just don't understand how creating a potential irredentist claim on the part of your closest and perhaps most valuable neighbor, one that, if not corrected in some fashion and regularized in some fashion, can result in arguments and strife for decades on, as we've learned from history in other areas. It seems to me it simply cannot be in Russia's interest to encourage this situation. But the thing that worries me most about the current U.S.-Russian relationships and the tensions is how we have allowed the progress in reducing nuclear weapons to stall. Not only that, there's even a termination of joint work to ensure the safety and security of existing arsenals. With all of the other problems in the world that are getting the attention now, I would say this is the elephant in the room, which seems to be invisible, but one which, if we are not careful, can begin to dominate it again. I think it is urgent for the United States and Russia to resume intensive discussions about nuclear weapons, to restore the joint guarantees to the safety of these weapons, and begin a process of bringing U.S. and Russian weapons closer to the level of the other nuclear powers, at which time there should be an expectation that the other nuclear powers also begin this process. And I think that is urgent. Now, I obviously am not in a position to speak for my government, but I believe as a citizen that if there is an interest on Russia's part to pursue this, I believe it will find approval and cooperation on the part of President Obama. The problems of continuing the present confrontation is that we could face again, certainly not the deliberate use of nuclear weapons. Our governments are not insane. But the problem is, if you multiply these other problems, and if you are in the framework to think the worst of everything that the other person has done, then inevitably there's going to be political pressure on both sides to increase one's nuclear potential. And if one starts it, the other is going to try to go one better. That would be a very, very dangerous world. Final few words. This is supposed to be about threats and cooperating for them. We've been speaking almost entirely about terrorism and military threats, to some degree economic. The big threats, I believe, that will confront my grandchildren and most of your children is the combination of environmental degradation the state failure in many parts of the world, the growing disparity between the rich and the poor, the lack of attention actually to care the earth which nurtures us, as Pope Francis has reproached us. These issues are issues which cannot be solved without cooperation. And I don't mean just US-Russian cooperation or EU-Russian cooperation. It must be wider cooperation. Obviously, we have to deal with the hot issues that we've been talking about. But we should, if we are thinking of cooperating in the future, also pay attention to these broader and perhaps more serious issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Matlock. Thank you for reminding us of what was necessary and what worked in ending the Cold War, and in many respects what's missing in our own day at this point. Now what is expected to happen in a moment, I will turn to our speakers and allow them to exchange ideas, raise some questions among themselves. Then I'll turn to you for your questions. But before that, if you will forgive me and if you will indulge me, let me begin the conversation with a general point that leads to a question. And what I say in the next moments will be frank, and I defend myself in doing so by quoting you, President Putin, when you spoke to the Munich Security Conference in 2007, when you said, "This conference's structure allows me to avoid excessive politeness and the need to speak in a roundabout, pleasant, but empty diplomatic terms." If that's the way I defend myself, it's the way I urge you to ask your questions for this to be a genuinely productive exchange. This meeting has been about a troubled world, the challenges that this troubled world is delivering for us, many of them intensely, summarized in the comments by our speakers up to this point. And Valdai is about developing ideas, the struggle in order to begin addressing those challenges. I would argue, and here forgive my focus on my own country, the United States, that of the troubled relationships in the world, in the context of this troubled world, the one that is the most important, not merely to my country and to Russia, is the US-Russia relationship. The one that's the most important of the troubled relationships to the outside world. In thinking about this, yesterday, one of the particularly successful panels, I thought, was the one on the role of diplomacy in dealing with the challenges that we face now. Ambassador Richard Burke introduced the notion that it's more than diplomacy, it's even more broadly the question of statecraft. And by diplomacy and statecraft, he wasn't talking only about ambassadors or even foreign ministers, he was also talking about national leaders. He, of the 5 qualities, finished after identifying prudence and courage and creativity, finished with empathy. That if you're going to succeed in statecraft, it has to be manifest in a capacity to empathize with the other side. That doesn't mean agree with the other side, as he made plain. It is a question or a challenge of putting yourself in the other side's shoes. If you're going to be effective in dealing with the other side. And he finished by saying the problem today is a deficit of empathy. And I think he was speaking particularly about the deficit or the lack of empathy in the US-Russia relationship at this point. I would add to that, and this is the thrust of my point, there's something that's a prerequisite even for exercising empathy effectively, and that is that you understand the other side accurately. And I think that's what's missing at this point. Instead, we have narratives that each of us is operating with in Washington and more broadly in our media, and in Moscow and more broadly in your media and national leadership, with, from my point of view, fundamentally warped narratives of what's guiding the way in which we're dealing with one another. The result of this is the fundamental feature of the U.S. relationship right now. If it has a resemblance, it is to the early years of the original Cold War, not even the later years of the original Cold War. And that is, each side is assigning, if not exclusive blame, for the deterioration in the relationship, the disrepair of the relationship, then by far the majority of the responsibility. The blame is attached to the other side, and the interest in the interaction, the dance that we've done together that brought us to this point, is missing from the relationship right now. This is one of the frank portions of what I have to say. On the Russian side, the understanding that I think many have on the outside is, at this point, the Russian interpretation of U.S. foreign policy is not merely that over these years it has been misguided and created the problems that you, Mr. President, have summarized in sharp terms on many occasions going back to that 2007 speech in Munich, but that more recently it is not just misguided policy, but it's malevolent policy. And that U.S. foreign policy today is designed, in the case of Russia, to do genuine harm to Russia's foreign policy interests, to contain Russia, to roll Russia back, to reduce its influence, and to damage its strategic interests and stakes, both more broadly and within the immediate neighborhood. But even beyond that, that it is now a case of a U.S. policy committed to regime change within Russia itself, having followed a policy of regime change in U.S. strategic interest from the color revolutions to Iraq to Libya and then would be in Syria, now Ukraine, in this context. This is not something that I pull out of thin air. This was essentially the theme of Nikolai Patrushev's interview in Rossiyskaya Gazeta a year ago. It is directly the notion of regime change as a part of U.S. foreign policy that was in Foreign Minister Lavrov's address to the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy a month later in November. That's on the Russian side. My own view, and others from various positions, U.S. and otherwise, can agree or disagree with it, is this is a misreading of what is the fundamental impulse behind U.S. policy toward Russia. You can criticize many aspects of the Obama policy, but I wouldn't do it in those terms. On the U.S. side, there is an equal distortion in terms of the narratives that I'm referring to. Within the administration itself, I think that most, not all, certainly not the Secretary of State, and most of the time I think not the President himself, are persuaded that what I've just summarized as the Russian view of U.S. policy indeed exists. The Obama administration believes that's the attitude within Russia at this point and of your government. Their view, however, is that they do not sense any responsibility for having produced it. And they're having difficulty explaining why it exists, but they come to the conclusion that as a result, there's very little they can do to change it. And therefore, there's very little that they're going to be able to do by way of cooperation or moving in the directions that several of you, including you, President Putin, exhorted should happen between the two sides. There is a larger part of the public, and I think the U.S. Congress and the media, that has a starker view and narrative, which I think is fundamentally distorted. And that is, the problem is not out of the interaction between the United States and Russia, or how we got here over however many years you want to look at, but that it is essentially, first of all, the result of Russian behavior, especially within the context of the Ukrainian crisis. And that is a product not of, as I've said, international relations, Russia's reaction to the outside world, the interaction. It is a function of the nature of the Russian political system and regime. And Russian behavior is determined not by that interaction with the outside world, but by what they would argue are the requirements of the Russian leadership and government as it's currently structured. A need for external enemies, a need to prevent democracy from creeping toward Russian borders, even an alternative source of legitimacy if there are economic difficulties in the country. Now, from my point of view, this is fundamentally wrong, but it is probably more widespread than even the first interpretation that I offered. Now, I make these points because I believe that before you're going to be able to make any progress toward achieving common ground and a common approach on the issues that we're talking about, the hard issues, because surely we ought to have a common goal at this point in acting together and dealing with ISIS. And surely we should be beginning to make progress on what Jack Matlock referred to at the end, and I did earlier, and you did, President Putin, in your comments, beginning to bring some order to this nuclear world. It leads to, and I apologize for having been this windy at the outset, it leads to two questions. First of all, the sheer practical question, and this is to President Putin, is this a mischaracterization of the way in which you, if you, as you say in Russian, называют вещи своими именами, see the challenge posed by the U.S. administration? But beyond that, if there is validity to what I'm describing, that is that the narratives that we're working with fundamentally get in the way of achieving the kind of cooperation that you want to see and that I think our leadership wants to see and other governments want to see, how do we begin moving in another direction? Or to put it in a phrase, how do we begin changing the trajectory at this very basic level?
Во-первых, я хотел бы поблагодарить всех
Most
выступающих.
importantly, I'd like to thank all the speakers. I believe we have had a very substantive and interesting panel discussion, and it's of pleasure for me to say that we are having here, probably we're waiting for a substantive, not a slag debate. I will not go into historical details, who is to blame for the collapse of the USSR. I believe primarily these are internal reasons, and Mr. Ambassador is definitely right. The poor structure of the political and economic system of the ex-Soviet Union were the foundation and the root cause for this collapse. And who contributed to that is a different matter. I don't think that our geopolitical partners were on the sidelines of the process, but mostly it's for the internal causes. And Mr. Ambassador probably started a discussion with me, saying that, unlike myself, he doesn't believe the collapse of the USSR to be a geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. I still insist it was a tragedy, primarily and most importantly of the humanitarian nature, because 25 million ethnic Russians found themselves abroad against their will and overnight. So my point is that the Russian people turned to be the biggest separated nation in the world, which is a tragedy. Not to mention the socioeconomic parameters, because the welfare system collapsed as well as the economy. And the previous economic model, which was characterized by low efficiency, collapsed, but still there was a tragedy for families, for households and people. Now, with respect to a continuation of talks on the offensive arms reduction, you are right, we should continue the negotiations and the talks and dialogue, but I cannot say that nothing has been done in this domain by the Russian Federation and the United States. Still, we have signed a new START treaty, which has set certain limits for us and set forth goals for us to limit the offensive capabilities of ours. But the unilateral withdrawal of the United States from a treaty that was the cornerstone for the international peace and security and stability, from the ABM treaty, has aggravated things, and As it's a discussion club, I'd like to ask the distinguished Mr. Ambassador how he can assess the unilateral withdrawal of the United States from the ABM Treaty.
I was personally opposed to that withdrawal, and I take your point. I would say that I don't think that any subsequent plans for the sort of deployments were or could be a threat to Russian systems. But in general, I am not a supporter of ABM systems. I would point out that I think the main source of that is not to threaten Russia, but to secure employment in the United States. A lot comes from the military-industrial complex and the number of people it employs.
Господин посол,
Mr. Ambassador, I believe your arguments non-justified. I treat your experience with huge respect and your expertise with huge respect, and I know the diplomatic craft that you've been using. It's immaculate. You've been evading the direct answer, but still you gave some kind of answer, direct answer, with some decorating elements. Still, well, jobs that result in a threat for the humankind should not be created. And you, ABM systems creation would entail new jobs, but why create new jobs in this sphere? Let's create new jobs in biology, pharmaceuticals, high tech, non-related to arms production. Now, as regards whether it's a threat to Russia or not, please rest assured the US security specialists and the strategic arms specialists are aware that it is a threat to the Russian nuclear capability. And all the system is being created in order to diminish potential of other nuclear states, but for the United States to nearly zero. And the arguments were different, like the Iranian nuclear threat and others. In my speech, I have said that we always thought there was no threat, and now the whole of the international community believes that there is no threat, and the United States was the initiator of signing this agreement with Iran, and we backed and provided assistance to our American partners, and we finally reached a coordinated decision, and it has taken effect, and Iran has agreed to export enriched uranium, but now again a ABM system in place, an Iranian nuclear problem is on the table, and there has been a round of maneuvers. Until the end of this year, Romania will see the first component of this system, and by the 2020, the system will be installed in Poland. And the specialists know that the position areas for anti-missile systems can be used efficiently in order to deploy offensive cruise missiles there. Isn't it a threat to us? Yes, it is. And it changes the philosophy of international security. If one country believes that they have created a nuclear or missile umbrella, a shield that can be a safeguard against the response. In this case, it's free to use all its capabilities, which is the breach of the strategic balance, the upsetting of the equilibrium, and you being the person who was involved into the disarmament agreements and reached greater results, I may also praise you and express my appreciation of what you did. You and the Russian partners succeeded, but what is happening now cannot but be of concern for us, and I'm quite confident that you, at your heart, agree with this. Well, you said you're against, okay, against the unilateral withdrawal of the United States from the treaty. Now, with respect to Ukraine and the threat which it creates. Yes, it does create a threat and a danger, but wasn't it us who started all this? Just let's recall when Mr. Yanukovych lost the election and Mr. Yushchenko won the election back then. But how did Yushchenko come to power? There was a third round, a rerun of the elections, which is not provided for in the fundamental law, in the constitution, and it was backed by the Western nations. But this is barbarism, which is not democracy. They did it for the first time then and for the second time later, not long ago, when the coup d'etat occurred recently. And the position of Russia is not that we want to struggle with the choice of the Ukrainian people. We would accept any choice of theirs. They are a sister nation of ours, fraternal nation, but we're against such a means of changing power. It's bad anywhere, but it's inadmissible on the post-Soviet state, inadmissible at all, as we should say directly that many of the post-Soviet republics don't still have their own traditions, well-established traditions of statehood or stable political systems in place, and we should cherish what they have and help them develop this. Were we against dealing with people that rose to power during that rerun back then 10 years ago? Yushchenko and Tymoshenko, we worked with them. Many believe they are pro-Western politicians, but we met with them and we accepted them in the Russian Federation. We had quarrels and disputes with them on economic matters, but we cooperated with them. But how can one accept a coup d'etat? So will you organize another Iraq or Libya here? The official authorities of the United States never hesitate to accept that they spend billions of dollars. It's said in public. We spent $5 billion to support opposition. Is it a correct choice? Is it the right choice? Another colleague of ours, the moderator, has been saying that the United States, it's wrong to believe that the United States wants to change the regime in the Russian Federation, the political system. I can't but agree to your vision, because there's some act in the United States, probably referring to Ukraine, mentions Russia, and the aim is to provide more democracy to Russia. Can one imagine that we, in our internal law, would set the goal of providing more democracy to the United States? That would be impolite, at least, not to say more. But in principle, we could do this, and we have grounds for this. Everybody knows quite well that 2 times in the United States history, a president rose to power that was elected by the majority of the electors. Those electors were supported by the minority of voters at the same time. And democracy is the power of the majority of people. So a person elected by the minority of electors. So they have a problem in the constitution, but we don't require you to change your fundamental law. You know, we could debate for ages. But if something is, if the opposition is funded, internal opposition is funded, opposition is okay, but they should have their own internal sources. And if they receive billions from external sources, is this good political practice? Does it create an atmosphere of trust in the bilateral relations? I don't think so. Well, now, as regards promoting democracy, moving democracy closer to our borders. Probably you're a very experienced person, so I once again pay you the merit. Are we against that democracy should move closer to our borders? But what do you mean by democracy? Do you think NATO is democracy? NATO is a military alliance. So we are concerned about not the advent of democracy, but the deployment of the military infrastructures closer to our borders. How can't we, but not to react? You know what underlies the current problems and issues? I will share it with you, and we will make the document I will mention public. These are minutes of German politicians' conversations and the Soviet leadership on the eve of the unification of Germany, just prior to the unification of Germany. These are very curious minutes. It's like a detective. One of major politicians in the then Germany, one of the leaders of the Social Democratic Party, said to the Russian leadership, supreme Russian leadership, I will not quote, but I will say approximately what was uttered. If we don't agree on the principles of unification of Germany and the future of Europe now, the crisis will not come to an end after Germany is unified, and will be stepped up, and we will not get rid of them, but they will have new manifestations, and that's it. And when the Soviet leaders started debating with him, he was perplexed and bewildered and said, it seems I'm now defending upholding the interests of the Soviet Union, hinting at, driving at the fact that they might be far or short-sighted. But he said he was advocating for the future of Europe, and he turned to be right. So when your colleagues, Mr. Ambassador, never agreed on the potential pending issues, what would be the fate of Germany, whether it would become a member of NATO, what would the infrastructure development, military infrastructure developments be, and how security matters would be coordinated in Germany and in Europe. Nothing was enshrined or documented. It was just discussed orally. And everybody recalls my speech in Munich. And I said then that the NATO Secretary General then had said that the Soviet Union may be sure that NATO would not expand beyond the eastern borders of the then Eastern Germany. But 2 rounds of expansion we have witnessed since then, and now probably another's coming. So all these things cause our legitimate concerns, and we should work on that, definitely. But I must say that we are ready, despite all the difficulties. We're ready for that, and if we take, for example, the most acute issue of today, which is the ABM system, the missile defense system, we came with a proposal of a 3-way cooperation, US, EU, and the Russian Federation, talks between the 3 parties to look at what are the most dangerous trajectories and areas, and have common access to the control of the system and some other technical matters. But it was rejected, declined. It's not us who declined it, to decline to cooperate. And now another very acute matter, which is Syria. We're criticized to hit the wrong targets. Not long ago I said, being in Moscow, that if you know the right targets, please provide us a list. And if you know the wrong targets, please also provide us with a list. But they declined once again. We had a movie about the Russian Tsar, and one of the protagonists tells another one, how can I understand you if you say nothing? But now, at the military level, we start coming to terms with each other, because life makes us do so, and the circumstances make us do so. And our military start coming to terms because they're responsible people, and we could reach agreement on the political level as well.
Thank you. Now, I know that everyone is eager to begin asking questions and exchange, but I did indicate that we would allow our speakers to comment others. If there's anything at this end, President Klaus is indicating that he wants to get to you people. Is that agreement to the other speaker, Lariani? We turn to the audience. Okay, then your questions. Neil Buckley.
Mr. President, I'm Neil Buckley from the Financial Times. I'd like to ask you about Syria. I'd like to ask you how you can be so confident that Russia's military intervention in Syria can avoid the fate that you described for the interventions by other external powers in the Middle East and simply make the situation worse and increase the chaos. Also, could I ask you to use this forum to tell us more concretely and in more detail how you envisage the shape of any peace process and eventual settlement in Syria? Is Russia ready to accept, for example, a partition of Syria? Will Mr. Assad ultimately have to stand aside? And if he does, what kind of leader might replace him? Thank you.
Ну, если я вас правильно понял,
If I
то
got
первый...
you right with respect to the first part of your question, whether we are confident that our activities in Syria would be efficient. Well, no one can be confident in such matters. Only an insurance policy would give you confidence, but we act in line with our commitments and in line with our beliefs, pardon me, and with international law. We hope that the coordinated action of our offensive aircraft and other offensive capabilities coordinated with the Syrian army would yield positive results. And as I believe and as our military experts believe, there is positive result already. Is it enough to say that we have defeated terrorism in Syria? No, it's not enough. Additional efforts, considerable efforts are required to make such a statement, and huge, and let me emphasize, joint efforts are required. But we don't want to blame anyone now, because the coalition headed by the United States pounded the Syrian territory with 11 countries participating in 500 strikes hitting different goals, but with no result. And since then the terrorists have consolidated their presence and stepped up their might and expanded the area under their control. So in this respect, our colleagues, our partners did not mention to do anything efficient, and the first action by our armed forces and the Syrian armed forces have already yielded some results that are insufficient, and it would be good to join the efforts of everybody willing to fight terrorism, all the countries of the region and extra-regional stakeholders, including the United States, and this is what we propose. Our proposal is that at the first stage a military delegation should come to Moscow, and later we would be ready to send a very high-level political team headed by our Prime Minister to discuss political matters in DC. But it was said to us that our proposal is rejected and declined, but afterwards the American colleagues orally stated that probably they did not get what we said correctly, and the way is open, and we could pursue this path, and we could think of joining hands. And I really hope that in the coming days, the ministers of foreign affairs of the United States, Russia, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia would meet, and other regional powers should also be engaged. Without these, I'm primarily referring to Iran. The crisis cannot be resolved. Now let the ministers meet and talk. We've been in close contact with our Iranian partners, and Iran has contributed greatly to the settlement. Now, with respect to the partition of Syria, I believe it would be the worst case scenario. It would be inadmissible. It would not entail in the settlement to the conflict, a solution to the conflict. On the contrary, it would make the conflict expand and become permanent and aggravate. If Syria is separated into several parts, they would wage a war against each other forever, for good. Nothing good will come out of it. Now, with respect. Well, yeah, whether Assad should go or not. I said many times that it's absolutely inappropriate to decide externally whether a president, head of state, should go or not. It's up to the Syrian nation to decide, but with one reservation, we should be confident that it's done via transparent democratic procedures and some international oversight and control over the elections and other measures should be there. But that must be impartial, not a biased type of oversight. And as we see, the political process, well, our most general vision of how it should proceed, on the principles and the final goals, and the House, all that should be decided by the legitimate Syrian government and the opposition forces. Of course, we believe that the Syrian conflict builds not only upon fighting with the militants or the aggression of the terrorists that capitalized on the internal difficulties, and we should look at the internal problems and the threat of terrorism apart from each other, and the Syrian government and the leadership should definitely be in touch with those opposition forces that are ready for dialogue. As far as I got from my talk with President Assad the day before yesterday, he is ready for such a dialogue.
Thank you. Ali Lariani, would you care to respond to this question?
چرا من می‌خواستم در مورد تجزیه سوریه که گفته شد
You know, I want also to say that the division of Syria, let me comment on that the following way. I totally agree with His Excellency Mr. Putin about his analysis related to Syria. Okay, let's assume that you have divided Syria. And this division of Syria, what quality and make where? The territories which are at hands of terrorists, do you want to hand it over to the terrorists? You want to surrender these territories? Do you want to actually substitute the fight with empty talks? So the territories have occupied certain territories, so let us then hand this territory over to them and split Syria. This would be a strategic blunder. And terrorists would conquer other nations, other territories, and it would be then internationally recognized. As for the struggle and intervention which was started by Russia in Syria, I'd like to compare that with the situation when the coalition of 50 or 60 countries stage strikes on that region. You know, the Russians, over this short term, over this brief period when they fight with terrorism, according to our opinion, they achieved much more than the US-led coalition. The Russians attained certain results, that's clear. And what the US-led coalition did, this coalition comprised of 50 or 60 states. So let's analyze what they did over the last 18 months. You're aware that one of the strengths of the ISIS, that's the sales of petroleum via Syria to neighboring nations. And actually, they do not transport this petroleum on donkeys. They use tankers which go in columns. Why the Americans do not actually monitor those columns of the trucks? Why the drones do not see that? Why no strikes are staged against them? So it means that the Americans are reluctant to fight in Syria against the terrorists. So let us put it frankly that we are against the government of Syria. We don't want to cooperate with Syria, but you are not against the government of Iraq. You are cooperating there, so why you don't do anything about Iraq? Why you're not fighting terrorists in Iraq? Over the last year and a half, what they did they liberate certain countries, certain cities, such as Ramata, for instance? And when the mobilized militia fenced off the ISIS, and the Americans started just watching what they did. And why we need this coalition? Why we need all that? So the only question about that is that this coalition just plays certain games with the terrorists, keeps fiddling with terrorists. They bombed certain territories, but it was absolutely uncontrolled bombing. We didn't see anything serious either in Iraq or in Syria. And this division of Syria, I think it would be just handing over the territories to the ISIS. And we cannot neglect the Russian actions. In reality, we see that over a very brief period of time, Russia was a success, reached certain results in fighting against the ISIS. And that's very significant.
Вы знаете, я могу вам сказать,
Well, you know,
я знакомлюсь с видеоматериалами.
I usually keep track of the videos after the strikes have been made, and all of it is very impressive. So many ammunition is used there. They could even reach the aircraft itself. It seems that they collected munitions from all over the Middle East. So the volumes of ammunition are enormous there. Where did they get money from? Well, now it went down a bit. There are certain progress demonstrated by the Syrian army, moderate ones, but they will continue.
I now have a list, and that'll add to the list. The next person is Anatol Levin on my list.
Thank you. Anatol Levin, Georgetown University. Thank you, Mr. President, for coming to talk to us. I have a follow-up question about Russian air campaign in Syria, and that is its aims and its extent. Is it intended to help the Syrian army push ISIS and other terrorist groups back from some of their existing positions and contain them? Or is it your intention, in fact, to go further to defeat the terrorists completely? If so, might that require the extension of the campaign not just to Syria, but also to northern Iraq, where, of course, they have much of their strength is in fact based? Thank you.
Нет, таких планов, конечно, нет.
No, we are not planning that. There cannot be plans like that, because we haven't received a request from the Iraqi government to provide any sort of assistance to it. We do provide assistance to Iraq by supplying arms. We are doing that. We are contributing to this track, to the Iraqi track in fight against terrorism by supplying arms and ammunition. But the Iraqi government has not contacted us with this request, although we do cooperate with the government of Iraq, not only by supplying armaments and equipment, but also by exchanging information. As you know, it is in Baghdad where the so-called information center has been established, consisting of Iran, Russia, Syria, and Iraq. There we exchange information and define major areas of fight against terrorism, including ISIL, but we are not planning to extend military operations.
Thank you. The next person on my list is, I believe, if I correctly hear, with the mics, to Mustafa Tlili.
Thank you. Mr. President, Iran is a major power in the Middle East, a great civilization that has a legitimate role to play, not only in the Syrian crisis, but in the crisis that is shaking the Muslim world in general. Saudi Arabia is also a power. It claims to itself the role of protector of the Sunni world. You have good relations with both. You talk to both. Is there any role that you can play to bring together the two sides, to cooperate and to close the gap of antagonism between them and to work together for the benefit of the Muslim world? And by the way, I'm Mustafa Tlili from the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations. Thank you, Mr. President.
Сразу хочу вам сказать, что целью
Let me start by saying that the purpose of Russian military campaign in diplomatic efforts is to fight against terrorism rather than mediation between the representatives of different forms of Islam. We highly value our friends who exercise Shia Islam. We highly value the representatives of Alawites and Sunnis, but we do not differentiate with them. We have good relations with a number of states which exercise the Sunni Islam. We've got good relations with countries where the majority of population are Shias. We don't differentiate between them. Let me stress, the only goal we have is to fight against terrorism. At the same time, we realize in what reality we are. For example, in Syria, do you know that out of 34 members of the cabinet, approximately, the greater half are Sunnis? And in the army of Assad's army, the Sunni part is represented also in the same way as in the government. Actually, Syria has always been a secular state, but we know in what reality we are and we have to work. And if our actions would lead to launching the discussions between various religious manifestations so that these discussions could be friendly and they were developing in good neighborly relations so that it could bring together efforts in fight against terrorism, that our mission would be accomplished.
اجازه بدید من در این زمینه توضیحی بدم. دو تا خاطره براتون میخوام نقل کنم.
I would like to say something about Shia and Sunni that is a bargaining chip now of the modern world, what we are talking about. A couple of years ago, Israel attacked Lebanon, and there were the 30 days war there, and we supported Hezbollah and against the crime that Israel committed, and many of those created tension because Iran is Shia and Hezbollah is Shia, and that's why Iran should not support that. And they said that we should not cooperate. But then some time after that, we saw 22-day war in Palestine, and Israel attacked Gaza Strip, and we supported Hamas. Hamas are Sunni. So when the world saw that we supported Sunni, they said, well, they couldn't say that's Sunni and Shia, and they said there were Persians fighting there. So that's part of our history. That's the part of Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran. That's we're not getting in these minor things, in these tribals. The major problem in the region is that some of them are behind these scenes and don't want to speak openly. And the problem of terrorism is not a matter of Shia or Sunni. Which of these sects that from the very beginning of Islam, who of them are Azhara or some other parts that support that? Do they support all terrorism. Sunni hate terrorism. In Iraq, there are several tribes of Sunni, but many of them communicate with us. They say, we want to fight ISIS. Just there's one sect that was formed during this 100 years, and they are very belligerent, they're militants, they want to fight with everyone. See a Sunni or Shia, they believe that they're not trustworthy. That's what they say, and I just don't believe the propaganda.
Вы знаете, я вам сейчас сидел, думал.
Well, you know, I was just sitting here and thinking whether I should say that or not, but I opened up actually what is going on in our negotiations with President Assad. I asked him, how would you respond to the fact if now in Syria we manage to find an even armed opposition, but still willing to confront terrorists and the ISIL? How would you react to us supporting them in their fight against terrorism in the same way as the Syrian army? And he responded positively. We are contemplating that, and if we manage to do so, we will try to implement them.
Thank you. Microphone to the front, far left. Before you speak, excuse me, two things. Our common problem. We have about 30 at the maximum 40 minutes in front of us. I have a list of 18 people. So obviously some, and there are new hands that have gone up, so people are going to be disappointed. Second thing, I should have done this at the very beginning. As a courtesy to our distinguished speakers, when you begin, would you identify yourself and your affiliation, please? Thank you.
My name is Sheng Shilia. I'm from Xinhua News Agency. My question is about the role of Russia in the future world. Well, I'm deeply convinced that Russia has always been and will be a great power of the world. Well, we had a certain argument, discussion among scholars specializing in Russia. And we identified four opinions. One of the, just one group believes that the horizon will be decorated with 3 stars of first magnitude: Russia, the United States, and China. Others believe that there will be 4 centers of 4 strengths: Russia with Eurasian economic body, European Union, the United States, and China. The third group of scholars believes that there will be 2 groups of countries, the West and non-West. West is meaning the US and Europe, and non-West is Russia, China, and other BRICS countries and the third world countries. And there was a 4th group of scholars who believed that Russia will take the leading role, but in the second line. And then it will be followed by India, Germany, Japan, etc. But the first line will be taken only by the United States and China. So I would like to learn your opinion on this point. Thank you very much.
An answer would be simple. In the modern world, in the nearest future and in the longer term, the role and the position of any state in the world will depend on the stage of economic development of this country, on whether this economy is modern and future-oriented, on whether it is based on the high technologies, and on how soon it turned to a new technological order. I'm not speaking about territories or population or the military component, although all of it is very important indeed. And without these components, any country will not be able to take a lead or become one of the leading countries in the world. But the basics, the basic foundation, the most important is the economic development, relying on new technologies. I believe that Russia has all the chances to be among the leaders in terms of the level of education of the population and advancements in the fundamental science. Lots of problems here as well. There were lots of them. There will be like that in the future, in the same way as in other countries. But we continue paying more attention in reviving the fundamental and applied science and giving new momentum to the development of these very important areas. So, judging by these circumstances and natural competitive edge of Russia, I believe that without any doubt Russia will play a very important role. It is very difficult to give any ranking because it is a sports contest, but it is obvious for me that Russia has all the chances for a bright future. But of course, it should go hand in hand with the development of relations with our neighbors, our closest ones, who are our partners and allies within the framework of the Eurasian Economic Union, CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization, with such neighbors as China, with whom we've got the highest trade volume, which is over $80 billion US. These countries would also include such a brilliant country as India. We cannot but cooperate with Europe based on our Christian culture, and there are also many other advantages. 20% of our population is Muslim, by the way. In this way, we could be a link between many our partners and the Islamic world. And naturally, we count on the development of relations with the United States if, of course, our partners would like to develop this cooperation.
Thank you. The next hand that I have on my list, I don't have by name, but I think it's the second person on the last row from the left.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. Andrei Zagangov, San Francisco State University. My question is on the conflict of values, Mr. Putin, on the enhancing conflict of values between Russia and US. To what extent it will last? What we're seeing today, and that's something that we discussed at one of the sessions, just a very acute informational war struggle, very tough rhetoric on both sides. On the one hand, the West that is not imbued with spiritual values, and on the other hand, no Soviet autocracy, repressive system. And then if we follow on this rhetoric, well, that's the utmost point. This is the limit that we have achieved. Those Russians who love America, what should they do? Americans who love Russia, what should they do? What is the cause of all this situation? What are the reasons for that? Are they political reasons that lead in this fight for new world order? Or that is mainly cultural contradictions, very deep cultural contradictions that we get back to the times of cultural clashes that American Samuel Huntington once spoke about. So what is the cause of all that, in your opinion?
Well, you know, if we take a look at the discussions made by our philosophers and thinkers, the representatives of classic Russian literature, they think that the cause of confrontation between Russia and the West as a whole in the difference of mentality, and partially they're right. Russian mindset is based on the idea of good and evil, of the divine beginning, of the divine forces. The Western mindset, I don't want to be awkward, saying that, but still, the Western mindset is based on interests, on pragmatism. Nevertheless, and here we should be uniform in our understanding of terms. Behind you, behind your back, we see the mottos or slogans of our today's meeting. The English one, societies between war and peace. The logic of conflict in tomorrow's world, meaning that the societies between the war and peace. And in Russian it says war and peace. And then the most important part, a man. And then followed by the state and the threats of a greater conflict in the 21st century. In the English version, the conflict is stated as actually fait accompli, and not in the 21st century actually, but the conflict which will take place in tomorrow's world. So there are some differences in the terms used here. So what we need to do is to use these terms in a more precise way so that we could treat everything we write and say in the same way. That was the second thing. And third, I cannot but criticize certain aspects, but nevertheless, when at the core of today's politics there is exceptionality, then it is difficult to negotiate on that, because that is putting it back on our traditional values, which are hinging upon the equality of all the people in the face of the Creator. It doesn't mean that in this system of coordinates we cannot or should not find common ground. We will do so. Let me stress that. We would count on the readiness on behalf of our partners to do so. And what is to be done by those who love United States and Russia and vice versa? Thanks God there are people these people actually exist in this world. They should actually try to show that despite differences in the approaches among other different states to the course of development, they should try to bring two sides closer. If there are people loving the country, a different country, it means then there is something good about this country, and that is why these people who love a different country should explain their society and people who are involved in decision-making that Russia, for example, United States, should be treated with respect.
Is the fourth hand from the right over here in the second row, is that Ruslan Pukhov? Floor is yours.
Vladimir Vladimirovich.
Mr. President, I would like to politically incorrect question, not politically correct question. I think it may sound like that. Ruslan Pukhov from the Center of Strategy and Technology. Mainly we study military defense strategy. Primarily, we are speaking about man-pads to be delivered to Syria for use, and I know that some monarchies that we are negotiating with, we are discussing with them that can be given to them. But we know that Su 25 and 24 can go to a very low altitude, below 5,000 meters. That means that our pilots risk their lives. What will be the Russian government's or leadership's response to that? Please give at least hypothetical answer to that.
I believe that this question is politically correct. I don't think that it could be classified as politically incorrect, and I would respond to that pragmatically. As far as we know, well, I hope that I'm mistaken, but as far as I know, American military are already transferring anti-tank systems there, systems that are combating armored equipment and tanks. I believe that it is a huge mistake. I am sure that these arms would get into the hands of terrorist organizations. Second, our American colleagues, as you might know, started implementing the practice of dropping from the airplanes, ammunition, and military equipment. Who would get this ammunition and equipment, and against whom is it going to be used? I can tell you 100% that no one is sure, including those ones who are doing so, who would get a hold of this equipment. Even at the first stage, the right hands would get this equipment. At the later stage, it would get into the hands of Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIL, and many other terrorist organizations. Yet another grave mistake. Regarding the transfer of manpads and the possibility of doing so, I hope that it will not happen, because the American leadership, although we are diverging on many issues, nevertheless they are adequate people, they have common sense and realize that these armaments could end up in the hands of those people who would aim it against the American pilots, who are also flying over the skies of Syria. Illegally though, but they're still doing that. I think that this reason should prevent them from transferring similar armaments. Now, regarding different types of aircrafts, I've been flying in them, and I am really surprised and shocked by the way how pilots manage to do that. At the pressure they are under in this aircraft, you cannot even turn your head. Not only you have to control the aircraft, you have to manage the armaments. There are huge pressure changes because of the big change of altitudes. You cannot even lift your fingers sitting there. These are high-scale stunts, literally speaking, and these people should be highly respected, and we should pay tribute to them. Our military are naturally fighting against terrorism on the territory of Syria. They are protecting the interests of the Syrian people. But not only that, first of all, they are protecting the interests of Russia and Russian people, striking against those gangs and thugs who are a threat to our country. Naturally, they risk their life, and in that sense, they are all heroes, but they voluntarily picked this profession. That is their choice, and I'm proud of them.
Alexander Rar, and then next, Professor Desai.
From Berlin, my name is Alexander Rar. Mr. Putin, what is your assessment? Alexander Rar, a political expert from Berlin. I want to save time for my question. I would like to ask Mr. Putin, what's your assessment of the Minsk Accords going back to Europe? What are the obstacles for the implementation and for establishing or bringing peace to the east of Ukraine? What are your comments? How could you comment on your suggestions that you made in the UN about the common space from Lisbon to Vladivostok? And can you do that during German presidency next year in OSCE?
Alexander, I will answer both of your questions, but first let me finish. You know, you have had a sub-question which is quite difficult, and you said it's politically incorrect. Well, what if losses? What if there are losses? There are people killed in action. Like 50 years ago, the streets in Leningrad called me one thing: if a fight is inevitable, you should strike first, hit first. And the threat of terror attacks in the Russian Federation, I assure you, does not depend on our action in Syria. It hasn't become greater or lesser. It is permanent, unfortunately. We haven't taken any steps in Syria, and what made terrorists perpetrate this terrorist attack in Volgograd? Nothing. They're just misanthropic. They hate people. They want to fight and combat Russia per se. So we'd better fight them there than wait for them here. Now, with respect to the Minsk arrangements, I have previously said it, and I reiterate that there may be no other way forward if we want to attain long-lasting peace, durable peace in the southeast of Ukraine and restore Ukrainian territorial integrity. There can be no way forward but for the execution and implementation of the Minsk arrangements. Can Germany play a positive part in all this? Yes, it can. I believe that the federal chancellor and the French president are today quite impartial, because of political beliefs of theirs. They support the current Kiev authorities, but still they have a clear, impartial view of the situation on the ground, and they understand and realize that all the issues and problems there are not only black or white. There are many more shades to them. And I stated it during my meeting with the US President Obama in New York. I said that without Europe and the United States, there can be no solution found to the situation, because it's pointless to keep accusing Russia of either not implementing or not inciting the self-proclaimed republics to implement those accords. So it's no use if the key provisions of the Minsk arrangements are not executed by the Kiev authorities, and the Kiev authorities are not in compliance with those key provisions. It's no secret. We quite often speak of this. But let me repeat, what am I saying when I say that the current Kiev regime is not in compliance with the provisions of the accord? Well, first thing is the introduction of amendments to the constitution of Ukraine, which is directly stated. The document spells it out. But that must be done in coordination with the self-proclaimed republics. But the Kiev authorities introduced changes, not having discussed those amendments with the Southeast representatives. They say that have coordinated with the Commission of Venice, but the Minsk arrangement spells out that coordination should be with Donbass, with the Donetsk region. And second thing, it should not be it should be permanent, not caretaker amendments, no. But what has been introduced, as a matter of fact, the Ukrainian authorities have introduced an obligatory law on special status of governing those territories, and it has been passed already and adopted. And I asked the Chancellor and the French President and Ukrainian President what kind of law it was. And I got the answer that indeed it was the law adopted by the Ukrainian Parliament. Was it permanent, I asked. Yes, they answered. But I said, do you know that it's the duration of the law is only 3 years and 1 year has already passed? And Mr. Poroshenko confirmed my information, and the European partners stated, expressed their view, saying that the law should be permanent, not provisional. But if it's going to be a permanent law, it must be enshrined in the constitution. Then another piece of dispute we had about the municipal elections in the unrecognized republics. The Minsk package spells out that the Verkhovna Rada should adopt a law which is in the framework of the Ukrainian legislation, but that law must be coordinated with the self-proclaimed republics. And those republics submitted their proposals 3 times with no response. And the law that has been passed by Rada says that there will be no elections on those breakaway territories. Therefore, they proclaimed that they would have their own elections instead, and we have now managed to convince them of postponing the timeline of the elections. But it was agreed that a law should be prepared in concert with Kiev, a jointly prepared law. And the Minsk arrangement says that 30 days after the Minsk arrangement is enacted, there should be a decree by the Verkhovna Rada that the special governance status should be introduced. And the Ukrainian parliament did adopt such a law. Like formally they adhered to the Minsk arrangement, but they had one extra article there, Article 10, saying that it's gonna come into force only when elections take place, and that article was not coordinated with the Southeast. This is mere manipulation, sheer manipulation, and this is what I told my Ukrainian counterpart. So, well, on the face of it, at face value, it's okay, but in essence, it's humiliation. If everybody says that the OSCE standards should be applied for the elections, one should not be in two minds. We should all remember that the OSCE standards state that no one should be prosecuted in the framework of the elections, and all those heads of the breakaway republics have been accused and indicted by the Ukrainian authorities, but there should be some amnesty, and the law is not in place because there is an article that the election should come first, but there are no elections, and the special law should be enacted in coordination, and a special law on amnesty must be put in place, which is the global standard. One cannot carry out elections at a territory where people at a territory where people who want to exercise their suffrage are persecuted and prosecuted. So now the ball is on the side of the Ukrainian party, and the Ukrainian regime should work with their European and American partners and come to terms. I'm sorry for taking too much of our time, but I felt obliged to clarify my stand.
We're now entering the last 10 minutes. Professor Desai and then Angela Stent. Okay.
Radhika Desai, Geopolitical Economy Research Group. President Putin, I have 2 questions for you, one about the economy and the other about Syria. I completely agree with you that any kind of major role that a state may end up playing in world affairs must rely on having a strong economy. And of course, recent developments such as the decline in the price of oil have created a lot of problems for the Russian economy. And for the last many years, we have been hearing that that the government recognizes that it's important to diversify the economy away from an over-reliance on energy. So my question is very simple. What are the major initiatives that you are taking in order to do so, and what are the chief obstacles that need to be overcome before a diversification, a successful diversification of the Russian economy away from oil can be realized? And in the case of Syria, I guess I'm just left wondering, I was very interested in your speech and various other things you have said, and at various points you referred to, of course, the agreement between Russia and Iran and the governments of Iraq and Syria to try and coordinate actions in order to defeat the terrorists. On the other hand, you also mentioned that it would be important in this process to meet with the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, etc., in order to come up with a common plan to achieve that. Now, given that as far as it appears, the US goal, insofar as it is definitely, or one of its goals is to get rid of the Assad regime, whereas the goals of your coalition is to try to support it, it is very likely that the second meeting may not occur. In that case, how far can a cooperative effort by the four, Russia, Iran, Syria, and Iraq, how far can it go, and what might it be able to achieve in the absence of such cooperation? Thank you.
Первый вопрос.
Well, picking your first question on the economic crisis and economic issues and development thereof. As we know, all the international institutions and UN, World Bank, IMF, and other organizations state that the global economy is not going forward at the pace we all dreamt about. And all the global economy in this case is suffering from some crisis manifestations, and the Russian economy is going through several problems and tests related not only to politicized restrictions in the economy, the so-called sanctions that play a certain part, but it's not the decisive part. The most important and decisive factor of curbing our growth and slowing down of the economy is the slump in our traditional export commodities. But that is true not only for the Russian Federation, but for virtually all the emerging markets. The Russian market suffers indeed, but probably to a bit less extent than other emerging countries. Just look up the statistics. What should be done? And you have said and mentioned it by yourself that in the Russian Federation, and we have consistently been saying that diversification is required in order to attain a better status, a more diversified one, relying on high-tech industries. And yes, we've been advancing slowly, yes, but are there any positive developments? There are positive developments and changes. And I may cite examples for, like 5 to 7 years ago, the share of oil and gas sector in our GDP was at 14 percentage points. Today, the oil and gas share in the GDP of our country is 9% only. And to compare and contrast, let me cite the figures of the Saudi Arabia. If I'm not mistaken, the oil and gas sector accounts for 45% of the economy, and in some of the Gulf countries it's 50%. In Venezuela it's 30%. We have 9% of our economy belonging to the oil and gas sector. And despite all the issues and difficulties over the past quarter, probably this is the result of our efforts, and I'll tell you what our efforts are. So machine engineering has picked up, and the machine equipment exports have increased. So what the main issues are as of today? They're as follows. Our economy facing this global environment is not ready to maintain the necessary pace of growth, and certain sectors of our economy have been hit hard, and we should pay special attention to that, and I'll tell you what are the measures that we envisage. For some of the industries, this slump has been 10% or even greater, but we know what we should do. And finally, we should pay our attention to the ruble, the national currency, which is taken care of by the central bank, and they've been quite able in this. And I believe that those are members of the government who believe that we have passed the trough of the crisis are true, and now we should look at the factors I have mentioned, supporting the sectors that suffered most, which is construction, machine engineering, car manufacturing, high-tech industries, construction sector, and our government has envisaged additional appropriations to the tune of 150 billion rubles, and agriculture will get another 300 billion rubles of appropriations. So we have the financial capabilities and provide the backing, but we should continue with what we did over the past years. And central bank is indeed following that track of stabilizing the exchange rate of the ruble. And this is one of the indicators that makes us judge that there is some balance struck, some stabilization achieved, and despite the oil fluctuations, we have the trade surplus, which has been steady despite all problems. We have quite high forex reserves, $370 extra billion. We have the very good governmental reserves. One fund contains 70 billion, and the other one has 74 billion. And we've been planning our development so that we will spend some part of these reserves, but by the end of 2018 we will have sufficient reserves, but for the central bank's ones. Over the past quarter, the budget deficit was 1.5 percentage points only, and the inflation rate is falling, has been falling. Last year it was 0.5%. By the end of the year, the cumulative inflation will be considerable, quite sizable, around 12% per annum. But we assume that in the upcoming years there'll be a downward trend, which is already observed right now, and we'll be able to maintain it. And we'll do our best to maintain the macroeconomic parameters in good shape with prudent policies with respect to public spending, and bearing in mind the fact that now the real wages are a bit down. I'm sure that in future, given the economic growth, the wages would rise. But now we are to make some decisions, pass some legislation to move to the targeted support of the disadvantaged social strata. So this is more or less the set of tools that we are going to use to provide for further diversification of our economy and maintain the necessary growth rate. Now, with respect to Syria, you said that the US will get rid of, the US wants to get rid of us, Assad. But our aim is to fight terror and to defeat terrorism and to help President Assad defeat the terrorists and create favorable conditions for a start, and I hope real continuation, successful continuation of the political process and
I'd like to say a few words of explanation about this, and it's not as pessimistic as you were saying. The countries that you mentioned in the last 4 years, when Syria was involved into all this story, from time to time, they come to us and they say, yes, 2 weeks later, Bashar Assad will go. But 4 years later, he is still in power. And during those 4.5 years, and until Russia joined the military efforts of resolving this issue, and let me draw your attention to this fact. The countries that in the last 70 years or 80 years, they never had even a single precedent of conducting elections, they have the right to talk about democracy in Syria. And that Bashar Assad was not democratically elected. Those who do not allow their women to drive cars, they talk about democracy in Syria. And there are many ironic situations in the region and paradoxes. And please, you cannot just be stubborn as you try to manage the world. Some countries say Bashar Assad should go 100%. What kind of behavior is that? A few years ago, one of those regional leaders, I met him, and he, back then, they had a war with Iraq, and when he saw me, he said, this prime minister of Iran or Iraq should go because he did not speak on the phone well with me. And then I spoke with him for 10 minutes on the phone, and he already said that two leaders should have gone. And I think that in the future, you don't have to have this pessimistic attitude.
As a matter of fact, they should come to terms and develop a pragmatic position.
We are now at time, so first of all, I apologize to the 9 people who are still on my list that will not be able to ask questions. Secondly, let me express my admiration to all of you for first your endurance and your patience and your good questions. And above all else, I think I speak for you and for me in thanking this extraordinary group, beginning with Speaker Liliani and President Putin and President Klaus and Ambassador Matlock for what they've done for us for this afternoon. An announcement as we leave, there's now a reception and dinner for all of you in what is called the Kashtani Zal, the Chestnut Hall, which is above, the floor above the reception area, the same level with the Panorama Restaurant, but one level up, and there's only one staircase to it, but that follows now. So thank all of you. I thank the Valdai organizers, Andrei and Fyodor in particular, and especially the interpreters who have put in a remarkable effort for us.